If this doesn't shock you, nothing will. The first bark came through the rain like a gunshot. Mason Reed stopped dead in the black timber, and listened so hard it hurt. Water slid off the brim of his old field cap and into the collar of his jacket. Around him, the forest breathed in wet silence, pine needles dripping, branches creaking, mud shifting under its own weight. Then the bark came again. Sharp. Urgent. Wrong. Not the bark of a dog chasing scent. Not the bark of a dog warning off a stranger. This was the sound Ranger made only when something had crossed the line between strange and dangerous. Mason's hand tightened around the flashlight at his side, though he didn't turn it on yet. Light could expose you. Habit said that before thought did. Even now, 3 years removed from the teams, the training lived inside his bones. Move slow. Hear first. See second. Assume nothing. Trust the dog. "Ranger!" he called, voice low but steady. No answer. Only another bark, farther downhill now, deeper in the storm-thick woods. Mason swore under his breath and started forward. The slope behind his cabin was bad enough in daylight, all roots and slick stones and trenches carved by runoff, but at night it became a trap disguised as familiar ground. He had chosen this place because no one came here. No neighbors. No curious eyes. Just an old fire road, a collapsing shed, and forest wrapped around silence. It was the kind of place a man picked when he was tired of hearing other people tell him he was lucky to be alive. A branch snapped somewhere ahead. Mason froze instantly. His breathing slowed. His posture changed. The tired, solitary ex-SEAL vanished, and something colder stepped into his place. He angled his head, letting the rain blur into the background so smaller sounds could rise through it. He heard water rushing in the creek below. Heard the flap of loose bark in the wind. Heard his own pulse settle into a combat rhythm. Then a low growl rolled through the dark. "Ranger!" Mason moved faster. His boots sank into mud as he cut through a stand of cedar, one hand out, the other brushing the pistol holstered under his jacket. He hated carrying it on his own land. Hated what it said about the way his mind still worked. But some habits didn't leave, they just waited. The dog barked again, closer now, followed by a crash in the undergrowth that made Mason break into a run. He found Ranger in a clearing he had never seen before. That was the first thing that put ice in his chest. He should have known this patch of forest. But the storm had transformed everything. One of the older oaks had split and fallen, tearing brush with it, exposing a circle of raw earth Mason would have sworn had not existed yesterday. Ranger stood at the edge of it, rain slicking his black antennae coat flat against his muscular frame, ears rigid, chest heaving. But he wasn't looking at Mason. He was staring at a dead tree. It stood near the far edge of the clearing, huge and weather-blasted, its trunk twisted wide as a truck. Lightning flashed beyond the ridge, and for one white second Mason saw that the center of the trunk was hollow. The opening yawned black and vertical, large enough for a man to crawl into if he was desperate or stupid. Ranger barked at it once more, then backed up. That stopped Mason colder than the storm. Ranger did not back away from deer, coyotes, or bears. In Afghanistan, he had once lunged at a doorway wired to explode before Mason even saw the trigger line. If Ranger stepped back, it meant his instincts were pulling in two directions at once, attack and avoid. "What do you smell?" Mason whispered. Ranger's lip curled. His growl deepened. Mason took 2 slow steps forward. The clearing stank of wet rot, bark, and churned dirt. Under that was another odor, thin but distinct, teasing the edge of memory. Metal. Old water. Something sour and sealed. Mason swept the flashlight beam low over the ground now. The beam caught broken branches, claw marks in the mud, and something else, footprints. He crouched instantly. not animal. Human. The impressions were partial, blurred by rain, but real enough. A heel. A tread edge. Recent enough that water hadn't fully erased them. Mason tracked them with the light and saw where they came from. Not from uphill, not from the fire road, but from the creek side, where nobody should have been coming from at this hour unless they were lost, hiding, or hunting for something. Ranger let out a short bark. "I see them," Mason said. The rain hammered harder through the trees. Mason rose slowly, every muscle in his back tightening. One set of tracks went toward the hollow tree. Only one set came away. He stared at that fact for a long second. Maybe the rain had washed the others out. Maybe he was reading it wrong. Maybe somebody had taken shelter and left another way. Maybe... Ranger suddenly snapped his head toward the woods behind them and barked twice in rapid succession. Mason wheeled around, flashlight beam cutting hard through branches and rain. Nothing. No figure. No movement. Just dense trunks and darkness. But the feeling hit him anyway, that old electric sensation crawling up the spine, the one that said eyes were on him. He killed the light. For 3 seconds he stood in total darkness beside the dog, hearing only rain and his own measured breathing. Ranger's growl turned, tracking something Mason could not yet place. Left to right. Then stillness. The forest held its breath. A soft knock came from inside the hollow tree. Mason's jaw locked. It was so quiet, so unnatural against the storm, that for a moment he wondered if his mind had made it. Then it came again. Knock. Knock. Not a branch. Not an animal shifting in bark. Something deliberate. Ranger exploded into barking. Mason stepped forward before fear could vote on it. He swept the light up, directly at the opening now. The inside of the tree looked bottomless, its edges ragged and black with decay. The beam reached it only a few feet before darkness swallowed it. The hollow was deeper than it should have been. Another flash of lightning lit the clearing. And in that instant Mason saw scratches cut into the bark around the opening. Not natural scratches. Lines. Straight. Repeated. Intentional. A cold memory slid through him before he could stop it. A wall overseas, coded marks near a hidden cache, a younger teammate grinning and saying, "Somebody always thinks they hit it better than they did." The memory ended where it always ended. Heat, dust, blood, and Owen Vale collapsing in Mason's arms with surprise still frozen on his face. Mason shut his eyes for half a second, but that was enough. The old guilt rose fast and mean. Not now, he told himself. Not here. Ranger pressed against his leg for one brief moment, just enough contact to ground him, then returned to staring at the tree. Mason drew a breath, wiped rain from his eyes, and forced himself closer. The mud near the tree base was disturbed, not just by footprints, but by drag patterns. Something heavy had been moved recently. He knelt and brushed aside wet leaves with the back of his glove. The flashlight revealed a rusted hinge half buried in the soil. His mouth went dry. The tree was hollow, yes, but there was metal in the ground around it. Ranger whined now, a sound so rare it hit harder than barking. "Easy," Mason murmured, though he wasn't speaking to the dog alone. He rose and circled the trunk slowly. Rainwater had carved a narrow channel around it, washing away dirt. In that washout Mason saw the faint edge of something flat beneath the mud. Square. Man-made. He crouched lower and scraped at it with a stick. Metal plate. Every nerve in his body went taut. Behind him, Ranger barked once, violent, warning. Mason spun, pistol out now, the motion pure reflex. Again, nothing visible. But this time he heard it. A footstep. Somewhere beyond the fallen oak. One heavy shift of weight in the dark. Then silence. Mason moved to put the tree at his back, and the dog at his flank. His mind began assembling possibilities with brutal speed. Trespasser. Hunter. Drifter. Someone using the storm for cover. Someone who knew this place existed. Ranger's fur stood up along his spine as he tracked the same direction, teeth bared, but he did not lunge. He was waiting for a command. Mason didn't give one. Because beneath the fear of being watched, another realization was opening its own jaws. The metal plate in the mud. The hinge. The marks on the bark. The single set of tracks in, one set out. The knocking from inside the hollow trunk. This was not an accident. This was not just an old dead tree. The storm cracked overhead with thunder so violent the ground seemed to flinch. Ranger barked at the blast, then pivoted back toward the opening. His posture changed again, not just aggression now, but urgency. He pawed once at the earth near the roots and looked straight at Mason, whining through clenched teeth. Not only danger! Hurry! Mason understood the message with chilling clarity. Something was inside. He stepped toward the hollow, sweeping the beam one final time across the interior, and there, far deeper than the light should have reached, something reflected back. Not eyes. Not water. A dull yellow glint. Metal. And just beneath it, almost hidden by darkness, came a sound so weak Mason nearly missed it. A human breath. Then a whisper. Help! Mason felt the world narrow to that one word. Ranger lunged toward the tree. And from the woods behind them, something started moving fast through the rain. The movement behind them crashed through the rain again, closer now, branches snapping one after another, as if something heavy was cutting straight toward the clearing. Mason did not waste time guessing what it was. He dropped to one knee beside the hollow trunk, flashlight beam jerking between the black opening in the dead tree and the woods beyond the fallen oak. Ranger stood at his side, barking so hard his whole body shook, for lifted teeth exposed. The whisper from inside the tree had been real. Someone was down there. Someone alive. A child, he knew now, was fighting the dark alone below, and whatever was moving through the storm was closing in. Ranger, hold! The dog shifted instantly, stepping in front of Mason and facing the tree line. Rain rolled off his muzzle and dripped into the mud. He did not take his eyes off the dark. Mason holstered his pistol for one dangerous moment and shoved his arm deep into the hollow. Rotting bark scraped his sleeve. The inside narrowed, then opened into empty space. His gloves slid lower until his fingers struck metal. A hidden edge. He leaned closer, forcing the flashlight between his teeth. The beam angled down the trunk and revealed what the storm had exposed. A steel hatch fitted into the base of the hollow, disguised beneath bark and roots. Mud had washed from the seam. Fresh scrape marks cut through old rust. Someone had opened it recently. Then from below came two faint knocks. Not settling wood. A signal. Mason pressed his face closer. If you can hear me, move away from the door. A long pause followed. Then a small, broken voice floated up through the hollow. Please, don't leave. Everything in Mason turned to ice. That was no grown man. It was a child. Ranger gave a sharp whine and barked toward the woods again. Mason looked up just as lightning ripped across the ridge. For one white second, he saw a human shape standing beyond the clearing between two pines. Tall. Motionless. Watching. Then darkness swallowed it. He wanted to clear the woods first. But the voice below had already set the mission. He scanned the clearing, spotted a rusted pry bar half buried near exposed junk, and snatched it free. He jammed the end under the hatch seam and drove his weight down. Rust groaned. Bark cracked. The hidden door shifted barely half an inch, then stuck again. Water trickled through the gap and echoed below. Rain was getting in. Move back! He shouted into the hollow. Move back now! A cough answered him. Tiny. Wet. Frightened. He changed his grip, planted one boot against a root, and pulled harder. His shoulders burned. For an instant the years rolled backward. He was no longer a man hiding from memory in a mountain cabin. He was the operator who had once ripped steel off a collapsed doorway, while someone screamed on the other side. The hatch shrieked upward. Cold, stale air burst out carrying mold, wet concrete, old chemicals, and human fear. Mason seized the edge with both hands and tore the concealed door wider. A narrow ladder sank into darkness. He aimed the flashlight down. The shaft was lined with timber and concrete stained black by damp. 10 feet below, the light found a cramped chamber. A battery lantern on the floor threw off a dying yellow pulse. In the far corner, wrapped in a filthy blanket, was a girl no older than 12. Her hair hung wet around a bruised face. One eye was swollen nearly shut. Her lips had gone pale from cold. Her right ankle was locked in a steel cuff attached to a chain bolted into the floor. She lifted one trembling hand to shield herself from the light, then lowered it slowly when she saw Mason was real. "Hey," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "I'm here." Behind Mason, Ranger barked once, deep and vicious. Mason flashed the beam back toward the woods, but the silhouette was gone. Only rain. Trees. Darkness. Yet the feeling remained. Whoever had been watching had not gone far. He looked back down. "Can you stand?" She swallowed hard and shook her head. "My foot! He locked it!" He? Mason lowered himself onto the ladder without hesitation. It creaked under his weight. The shaft smelled of soaked bark and sealed earth. Every rung carried him deeper into something hidden, so carefully it made his skin crawl. The girl pressed herself against the wall until Ranger's face appeared in the hatch above them. The German shepherd stared down, ears forward, growl rumbling low in his chest. The sight of him changed something in her expression. The panic loosened by a fraction. "There's a dog," she whispered. "His name's Ranger. My name is Mason. I need to see the lock." The blanket slipped from her lap as she pulled her chained ankle forward. The cuff had rubbed the skin raw. Mason examined the hardware fast. Heavy steel. Old design. Strong bolt plate anchored into concrete. He tested the chain with his hands, then with a knife from his belt. No use. The metal was too thick. He checked the cuff. Small padlock. Solid. "I'm getting you out." Her lower lip trembled. "He says that too." Mason forced the reaction down. "Not the same." Ranger growled from above, sharper now. Mason looked up. At first all he heard was rain. Then beneath it came the sound of an engine somewhere beyond the creek. Faint, but coming this way. The girl heard it too. Her face drained of what little color remained. She grabbed Mason's sleeve with both hands. "No. No, no, no. He comes back when it rains. He said storms are best because nobody hears anything and nobody looks outside." Mason's heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. He scanned the room properly for the first time. The chamber was smaller than a bedroom and packed with signs that turned his stomach. Shelves held cans, bottles, batteries, tape, rope, and children's books warped by damp. On the floor near the stained mattress sat a tin bowl, a broken doll, and folded blankets. Drawings covered one wall. Most showed trees, a house, a girl, sometimes a woman, sometimes a dog standing between the girl and the dark woods. But the farther along the wall the flashlight moved, the rougher the pictures became. The smiles disappeared. In one drawing, the tree was huge and black, its trunk open like a mouth. In another, the girl had crossed out the face of a man so violently the paper tore through. Then the beam shifted to the opposite wall. Photos. Old Polaroids and newer instant prints, some pinned with rusted nails, some taped crookedly to the concrete. Most showed the same girl at different times. Sitting on the mattress, holding cardboard squares with dates written in marker. Sleeping. Crying. Staring at the camera with that blank look children should never have to learn. But she was not the only child in those photos. Different faces looked back at him from older prints. A boy with a split lip. A red-haired girl clutching a stuffed rabbit. Another child too blurred by age to identify clearly. Some of the dates went back years. His mouth went dry. This was not one victim. This chamber had history. Ranger's bark detonated from above, echoing down the shaft. The engine outside was louder now. Very close. Mason turned in a full circle. There had to be something here he could use. Key. Tools. Weak point. Anything. His beam swept under the shelves, across the bottles, under the mattress, and caught on a rusted green metal case shoved against the back wall. Military issue. He knew that shape before he understood why. Mason dragged it into the open. The lid was scratched and stained, but a symbol still showed through the grime. He froze when the flashlight found it clearly. A naval special warfare insignia. For a second the room seemed to narrow around him. He stared at the trident on the case and felt an old memory rear up. Red dust, rotor wash. A storage crate kicked open under fire. Owen Vale laughing through blood on his teeth as he shouted, "If it's got our mark on it, it matters." The girl tugged weakly on his sleeve. "He opens that box when he talks." Mason forced his eyes off the insignia. "Talks about what?" Her mouth trembled. Rainwater dripped through the shaft above them. Ranger growled so low it seemed to vibrate through the floor. The engine outside stopped. Then the girl whispered the words that made every hair rise on Mason's neck. "The soldier in the woods!" Silence slammed into the chamber. Mason's voice came out rough. "What soldier?" She pointed at the box. "He says that's how he keeps proof. He says the soldier was supposed to die, but he didn't. He says one day he'll bring him here too." Mason looked back at the trident, at the scratched green paint, at the faint white letters almost worn away under rust. Then his blood turned to ice. Because beneath the insignia, barely visible in the shaking beam, was a name he knew better than his own. Owen Vale. The dead teammate Mason had buried in his mind 3 years ago. And from somewhere above the open hatch, footsteps started circling the tree. The footsteps above the hatch moved slowly at first. Not careless. Not random. Measured circles, deliberate and unhurried, as if the man outside already knew exactly what was under the tree and wanted the people below to understand one fact before anything else. He was in control. Mason went completely still. The name on the rusted green case burned in the flashlight beam. Owen Vale. For a moment, the letters became a face Mason had spent 3 years trying not to see. Owen laughing in rotor wash. Owen warning that the mission smelled wrong. Owen bleeding out in a ruined compound while Mason pressed both hands into a wound he could not close. Mason had watched the life leave him. He had signed the paperwork. He had walked away from the teams because some part of him believed he no longer deserved to wear the trident if he could not bring his man home. And now Owen's name was on a box in a hidden cell beneath a dead tree. A slow knock sounded on the hatch above. Once. Then twice. The girl folded in on herself, trembling so hard the chain on her ankle clicked against the concrete. Ranger's growl rumbled down the shaft. Mason snapped out of the memory and shoved the green case under one arm. "Listen to me," he whispered. "No matter what you hear, stay behind me." Her lips shook. "He likes it when people beg. Then we won't." Another sound drifted from above. A scrape. The metal hatch shifting on its hinges. Whoever was out there had found the opening and was testing it. Mason killed the flashlight. Darkness slammed over the chamber. The girl sucked in a breath. Mason reached out, found her shoulder, and squeezed once. Quiet. Stay. He let his eyes adjust to the weak yellow pulse from the dying lantern and turned toward the ladder. The shaft above had become a black throat. Only the rain was visible now, thin silver streaks dropping through the opening. Ranger stood at the top like a carved shadow, body squared toward whatever waited outside. Then a man's voice came down through the hollow tree. Soft, almost amused. "You shouldn't have opened that." Mason slipped his pistol free and moved to the side of the ladder where he had a line on the shaft without exposing himself. "Step away from the opening," he called. The voice above gave a low chuckle. "That dog always ruins things." Ranger erupted, barking with such violence the calm vanished. Mason heard scuffling above. Wet boots. A body shifting back. Then a curse, sharp and angry, followed by the metallic snap of something being drawn. Mason's mind mapped the angles instantly. Narrow ladder. Single entrance. Bad kill zone. If the man came down armed, the shaft would trap whoever committed first. But if Mason climbed up, he'd expose the girl. There had to be another way out. He swept the lantern's weak light around the walls again. Concrete. Shelves. Photos. Mattress. No door. Then he felt the draft. Tiny. Cold. Barely there. Coming from behind the shelving unit on the far wall. Hope moved through him like a spark. "Can you crawl?" he asked the girl. She stared at him. "What? Can you crawl if I get that chain free?" "I think so." Above them came a new sound. A clink. Then another. Glass tapping metal. Mason's stomach tightened. Bottle neck against hard edge. Improvised fire. "Down!" he barked. A bottle crashed through the hatch opening and shattered halfway down the shaft. Burning liquid exploded across the ladder in a sheet of orange light. Heat punched downward. The chamber filled instantly with smoke and the chemical stench of gasoline. The girl screamed. Ranger leapt aside at the top just before fire rolled across the hatch rim. Mason grabbed the blanket from the mattress and smothered the nearest tongues of flame before they could spread across the floor. Fire licked up the shaft walls, feeding on dry decay hidden inside the trunk. The lantern toppled, throwing the chamber into a wild flicker. Above the roar, the man shouted, voice no longer amused. "You should have left when you had the chance." Mason ignored him and hit the chain with the pry bar he had carried down. Once. Twice. Steel rang against steel. The ankle cuff held. Smoke dropped lower. The child curled into herself, coughing, one hand over her face. Mason smashed the chain anchor again, harder this time. On the third strike, the concrete around the bolt cracked. On the fourth, the anchor ripped half free. "Again," he muttered. He raised the bar and drove it down with everything he had. The bolt tore out of the floor. The girl nearly fell sideways as the chain came loose from the concrete. Mason grabbed her under the arm and hauled her up before she hit the wall. "Stay with me." Above them, Ranger barked once, then vanished from the opening. For half a second panic touched Mason harder than the fire did. Then he heard it, snarling, a man yelling, bodies colliding in mud. Ranger had gone for him. The shaft glowed red-orange now. Fire crawled around the upper bark and began dropping burning debris into the chamber. Mason dragged the shelf away from the wall. It scraped across the floor, spilling cans and bottles. Behind it, half hidden by damp concrete and mold, was a narrow rectangular vent covered by warped plywood and chicken wire. Barely enough. Mason ripped the wire loose with his knife and punched through the wood. Cold air flooded in. Beyond the opening was a crawl space no wider than a drainage culvert, descending into blackness. The girl coughed hard, clutching the loose chain dragging from her ankle. "Where does it go?" "Out," Mason said. He shoved the green case through first, then helped her onto her hands and knees. Crawl. Don't stop. Follow the air. She hesitated, staring at the darkness. Another flaming fragment fell from the shaft and burst at her feet. That decided it. She crawled into the tunnel, dragging the chain behind her with a scraping sound. Mason turned back toward the ladder. Smoke had become thick and predatory, pushing down from the burning trunk above. Through it, he could still hear the fight outside in broken pieces. Ranger snarls, a man grunting, boots slipping, then a sharp yelp that made Mason's whole body lock. Ranger! No answer. Mason took 2 steps toward the ladder, ready to go up into the fire anyway, when something heavy slammed across the hatch above. The opening darkened. The man had dropped the hatch shut again, sealing them in. Fresh panic surged through the girl in the tunnel behind him. He closed it! Mason forced himself away from the shaft. The ladder was no longer the route. The tunnel was. He dropped to one knee at the crawlspace opening. Keep moving! He shouted after her. Do not stop for any reason. A cough answered from deeper in the dark. He started in after her, but his hand brushed one of the fallen photos on the floor. The flashlight beam, lying sideways in the smoke, caught it for one brief second. It was not a child in the photo. It was Owen. Bearded. Gaunt. Alive. The picture had been taken in these same woods. A date was scrawled at the bottom. 10 days ago. Mason stared at it in disbelief as the chamber burned around him. Then from somewhere inside the tunnel ahead of the girl came a sudden metallic clang, followed by her scream. Mason lunged forward on instinct, snatching the flashlight and the photo in the same motion. He shoved himself into the crawl space just as the fire behind him surged hotter, and the tunnel swallowed him whole. Mud soaked his sleeves. Roots clawed at his back. The air was colder here, carrying the stink of wet earth and rust. Talk to me, he shouted. The girl's voice came back broken by fear. There's a door! I hit a door! Nothing about this place was simple. Mason crawled faster, dragging the green case by its handle, feeling the tunnel angle slightly downward before leveling out. The chain scraping ahead of him gave him her position. Then the flashlight beam hit the obstruction. A steel panel sealed the tunnel. No handle on their side. Just a flat sheet of metal set into concrete, with narrow gaps at the edges where cold air leaked through. The girl was pressed against it, crying now, hitting it weakly with both hands. Mason reached her, pulled her aside, and aimed the beam around the frame. There, a recessed slot, maybe for a key or lever, hidden under grime. He was reaching for it, when a sound came through the metal from the other side. Footsteps. Slow. Approaching. Then stopping directly in front of the door. The girl buried her face in Mason's arm. A voice, muffled by steel but unmistakably the same man from above, came through the panel with a smile in it. You found the second way. Mason raised the pistol. The man on the other side of the door laughed softly. Then a second voice spoke from behind the steel, low, weak, and so familiar it turned Mason's blood to stone. Mason, don't open it! The voice behind the steel door hit Mason harder than the fire had. Not because it was loud. Because it was impossible. For one frozen second, the tunnel, the smoke, the chained girl shaking beside him, the man waiting beyond the metal, none of it felt real. Only that voice did. Low. Ragged. Familiar enough to tear open wounds Mason had spent 3 years trying to bury under silence and mountain rain. Owen? The name left his mouth before a thought could stop it. No answer came at first. Just breathing through the cracks around the steel panel. Weak. Uneven. Like the man behind it was fighting pain just to stay upright. Then the muffled voice spoke again. Don't open it! The girl grabbed Mason's sleeve. You know him? Mason didn't answer. His mind was rejecting one explanation after another. Owen was dead. Mason had seen the blood, the collapse, the dust, the tarp, the signatures. Hadn't he? The violent parts had stayed sharp. The ending had always blurred. He had hated himself for that blur. Now the dead were speaking through steel. The man beyond the door chuckled softly. "You always were slow with miracles, Mason." The sound of his own name in that stranger's mouth dragged Mason back to the present. Whoever controlled this place knew exactly who he was. Knew Owen's name. Knew enough to bait him. "Step away from the door," Mason said, pistol steady on the seam. The voice beyond remained warm in a way that felt worse than shouting. "If I step away, your friend dies slower." Ranger barked. Muffled, furious, alive. The sound struck Mason like oxygen. The dog was still in the fight. The man heard it too. "That dog is costing me patience." The girl flinched. Mason kept his eyes on the door. "What's your name?" A pause. Then, "Names matter when people are leaving. You're not leaving yet." Smoke from the burning chamber was starting to creep through the crawlspace behind them in thin gray threads. The steel panel ahead trapped the cold, while the heat at their backs grew meaner. The girl coughed into her sleeve. Somewhere behind the walls, fire cracked through the roots and trunk above. Time was collapsing. Mason crouched by the slot in the steel and examined it with the flashlight. Not a keyhole. A recessed lever housing. Old. Industrial. But the handle had been removed from their side. The green case lay in the mud beside his knee. A terrible possibility moved through him. He grabbed the case, wiped grime from its side, and found a small inset latch beneath the Trident insignia. Locked. He slammed the case against the tunnel wall once. Twice. On the third strike, the latch snapped and the lid jumped open. Inside were sealed documents, a combat knife, a broken GPS unit, and an old brass utility key on a faded cord. The girl stared. "That opens it?" Mason looked from the key to the slot. Same size. Same shape. Of course it was. He slid the brass key halfway into the slot. Behind the steel, Owen's voice came again, stronger now. "Mason, listen to me. He wants you angry. He wants you close. Don't give him the door." Mason stopped. The stranger laughed softly. "Still giving orders, Vale?" The girl's breath caught. Mason's grip tightened on the key. "Owen, if that's you, tell me something only you would know." Silence. Then the answer came through the steel so quietly Mason nearly missed it. "Third floor barracks. You hated thunderstorms because your mother died in one. You told me that once when you were too tired to lie." The tunnel vanished for a second. Mason was back in humid dark, boots on a locker, listening to rain hammer military windows, while Owen cleaned a rifle and pretended not to notice the way Mason had gone still after the thunder. He had never told another man that story. The key trembled in Mason's fingers. The girl looked up at him, terrified. "It's him." "Yes," Mason said before he could think better of it. From beyond the steel came a sudden, brutal thud, followed by a stifled groan. The stranger had hit him. Mason surged toward the door on instinct. "Stop!" Owen barked, the old command voice flaring through the pain. "He's counting on that." Mason forced himself back half an inch. The pistol remained up. The key remained in the slot. Every nerve in his body was split between two missions: save the child and get to his friend. But both now ran through the same steel barrier, and the man beyond it knew it. "Why is he doing this?" Mason shouted. No answer from the stranger. Only a scraping sound, then something shoved under the gap at the base of the door. A photograph. It slid across the mud and stopped by Mason's knee. He picked it up and aimed the flashlight at it. The image showed Owen kneeling in these woods, thinner than Mason remembered, beard overgrown, hands bound in front of him. Beside him stood the tall man from the clearing, face hidden by shadow and rain hood. In the corner, a date had been written in thick marker. Yesterday. Mason's chest tightened so suddenly it hurt. The stranger finally spoke again, almost conversational. You see the problem now. He keeps surviving. A second object slid under the gap. Not a photograph. A military dog tag, dulled by weather and old blood. Mason stared at the stamped name. Owen M. Vale. He died? Mason said, not to the man, not to Owen, but to the part of himself that had built an entire life on that fact. I saw him die. Owen's next words came through clenched pain. No. You saw what they needed you to see. The stranger made a quiet sound of approval. There is. The girl began crying silently now, overwhelmed beyond language. Mason pulled her closer with one arm without taking his gaze off the steel. Smoke thickened behind them. Somewhere back toward the burning chamber would collapse with a muffled crash. Talk, Mason said. The man beyond the door inhaled slowly. Your mission 3 years ago wasn't a failure, Mason. It was procurement, equipment, routes. Men who could disappear cleanly if pointed the right way. Vale discovered the wrong ledger. Tried to walk out with it. That made him useful. Mason felt the words like impacts. No, yes. You were meant to die there. He was meant to vanish. Paperwork took care of the rest. The tunnel seemed to tilt. Owen alive. Owen taken. The mission staged. The death report false. The guilt that had eaten Mason for 3 years changed shape but not weight. Because if Owen had lived, then Mason had left him. Owen spoke again, voice breaking now. You didn't know. But Mason had already stopped hearing comfort. He saw every morning in the cabin. Every excuse for isolation. Every time Ranger had found him awake in the dark while rain tapped the roof like knuckles. He had built his life around surviving one failure. And the failure was still breathing behind a door. Ranger's bark exploded again, much closer now, followed by a man's curse and the unmistakable crack of a gunshot. The girl screamed. Mason's whole body locked. Then came snarling. Violent, immediate. Ranger had gone for him again. The stranger beyond the steel snapped, all calm finally gone. Hold that animal. He was no longer talking to Mason. There was someone else out there. The realization cut through shock like a blade. Mason jammed the key fully into the slot and twisted. The mechanism resisted, then clanked deep inside the wall. He grabbed the edge of the panel, ready to wrench it inward. Owen, he said. Get clear. No. Owen shouted. He wired the frame. Mason threw himself backward on reflex. A split second later the steel door erupted. Not a full blast, more a brutal directional charge built to maim anyone standing in front of it. Fire and metal punched through the tunnel in a cone of shrapnel. The panel blew inward halfway, screaming off one hinge. Mud, sparks, and fragments slammed into Mason's shoulder and cheek. The flashlight spun from his hand. The girl cried out as he covered her with his body. For 2 seconds all sound became a high white ringing. Then the tunnel rushed back in. Smoke. Heat. Blood in his mouth. The groan of twisted metal. Mason lifted himself and looked through the torn doorway. Beyond it was a larger chamber lit by red emergency lamps and scattered monitors running on backup power. Cables lined the walls. Filing cabinets. Camera feeds from the forest. On the far side of the room, chained to a support post and half collapsed on one knee, was Owen Vale. Alive. Thinner. Bruised. Beard gone wild. One eye swollen. Shirt dark with old blood and new. He looked up through the drifting smoke, and when his gaze found Mason, something broke across his face. Mason tried to rise. Then he saw the wires. Thin copper lines stretched across the floor around Owen's feet and along the base of the post. Not one trap. Many. Enough to turn the room into a killing ground if crossed wrong. And from somewhere in the red-lit darkness behind Owen, slow applause began. The applause came from the darkness behind Owen. Slow. Mocking. Patient. Each clap rolled through the chamber and came back off the concrete like it belonged to the room itself. Smoke drifted through the mangled doorway in red-lit layers. Wires glimmered around Owen's feet, some high enough to catch a knee, others almost flush with the floor, waiting for panic. Mason kept one arm around the girl and forced himself still. Blood ran warm along his cheek where the blast had cut him. His shoulder throbbed. Mud soaked his knees. The child pressed against him, trembling so hard the loose chain at her ankle kept clicking against the concrete. And Owen was alive. Not bait. Not a hallucination. Not guilt wearing a face. Alive. "Mason," Owen said, voice rough and frayed. "Don't stand. Don't trust the floor unless you can trace it." Mason obeyed at once. Training shoved the shock down where it could not interfere. He slowed his breathing until the room sharpened. The chamber beyond the shattered doorway was larger than any hidden cellar had a right to be. Concrete walls. Steel shelves stacked with boxes. Filing cabinets. Battery backups humming beneath surveillance monitors. A scarred workbench crowded with tools, radios, tape, and wire. The applause stopped. A figure stepped just far enough into the red light for the lower half of his face to appear beneath the hood. Rain beaded on the coat. Gloves. Heavy boots. Broad shoulders. A small, calm smile that felt worse than anger. "You always spoil the ending," he said. "I was certain the door charge would take both your legs." Mason raised the pistol. "Show me your hands." The man's smile deepened. "If I intended to show you anything useful, we'd be having a different night." Above them, Ranger barked once, then again, violent and close. A second later came the crash of a body hitting wood and the muffled curse of another man. The hooded figure had not been bluffing. He had help. The stranger heard Mason's attention lift. "Your dog is extraordinary," he said. "Loyal animals make terrible variables." Owen lifted his head against the post. "Leave him out of this." The stranger did not even look at him. "You are in no position to protect anything." Mason scanned the floor again. The wires were not random. They had pattern. Front arc from the broken threshold. Secondary spread around Owen's position. Tighter cluster near the shelves. Whoever built it wanted fear to do half the killing. The girl whispered. "He likes making people choose." "Stay against me," Mason said. "Do not move your foot unless I tell you." The hooded man laughed softly. "Still the rescuer." "What is this place?" Mason asked. "A room with memory." "Wrong answer." "On the contrary," the man said. "It remembers everyone better than they remember themselves." One of the monitors flickered and steadied. Grainy black and white footage filled the screen. The clearing above the tree. Rain slashing sideways. Flames breathing from the ruined trunk. Ranger shot across the frame like a black arrow and hit a man near the fallen oak so hard both vanished out of view. The stranger glanced at the monitor. "Payroll continues to disappoint," he whistled once. Somewhere to the left, deeper in the chamber, a lock disengaged with a hard metallic clunk. A side door opened by itself, revealing a narrow corridor angling farther down. Cold air breathed out carrying damp stone and machine oil. Too many rooms. Too much confidence. Too much history. "You kidnapped children," Mason said. The man tilted his head. "I retain liabilities. They're children. They become adults if you're careless." The girl squeezed her eyes shut. A savage heat moved through Mason, so sudden it almost made the trigger break under his finger. He forced it down. Rage was what this man wanted. Anger blurred timing and distance. "Who are you?" he asked. The stranger took one more step, enough for the light to catch the scar crossing his chin. Older than Mason expected. Controlled. The kind of man who rarely kicked doors, but decided which names went onto lists before those doors were hit. Recognition arrived in fragments. A corridor outside a briefing room. A quiet observer from a joint task cell. A liaison who spoke rarely and always seemed to know where people had been moved before anyone else did. Mason felt it lock into place. "You were there." The man smiled. "Adjacent." Owen closed his eyes once, then opened them again. "Don't let him build the story. He'll make himself sound necessary." "I was necessary," the man said. "Your team simply noticed too late." Memory hit Mason with surgical force. Coordinates changed at the last second. Satellite support delayed. An extraction route exposed. Owen saying the mission smelled engineered. "You fed us to them," Mason said. The stranger gave a tiny shrug. "I redirected unstable assets toward a larger outcome. Some of you died. One did not. That proved useful." Mason heard the words, but his gaze had gone to the green case near his knee. The stranger's eyes followed for less than a second. That was enough. He shifted it slightly behind his leg. The man noticed and smiled. "Careful. Curiosity is how this began." Above them, Ranger barked again, much closer now, followed by frantic scratching somewhere overhead. He was trying to find a way in. "He came back," the girl whispered. "He always comes back," Mason said. Owen looked toward the ceiling, and a tired smile touched his bruised face. "Still smarter than most men I've met." The hooded figure watched in silence. Then red warning lights ignited one by one near the far wall. First one. Then another. Then more, descending in sequence down the side corridor. Owen saw them and went pale. "Mason," he said, suddenly urgent. "If he starts the purge, nothing here survives." The stranger gave a pleased hum. "Eventually he says useful things." "What purge?" Mason asked. But Owen was not looking at the man. He was staring at the open green case. Mason looked down. Inside, beneath sealed documents and a cracked GPS unit, lay a folded child's drawing he had missed in the smoke and blast. He pulled it free and unfolded it one-handed. A huge tree. A woman and a little girl holding hands. A dog standing beside them. In the upper corner, almost hidden under later pencil marks, was a symbol that did not belong in a child's drawing. The Naval Special Warfare insignia. And beneath it, in an adult hand far steadier than the child's lines, were 4 words. "He came before the storm." The girl made a broken sound. "That's my mother's writing." Every muscle in Mason's body tightened. The stranger stepped back into the darker part of the room. "Now we are improving." A second monitor flickered on. Then a third. Then all of them flashed white at once. When the image cleared, the same woman appeared on every screen. Older than the drawing. Bruised. Pale. Alive. She sat in another underground room, wrists bound to a metal chair. Her hair, streaked with gray, hung loose over one shoulder. The girl lurched forward so hard Mason had to catch her before the loose chain dragged across the first wire. "Mom!" The woman on the monitors heard that. Her head snapped up toward the camera. Recognition shattered across her face. Love. Terror. Disbelief. Hope. "Lena?" she whispered. The chamber seemed to narrow around that one word. Owen spoke through clenched teeth. "Mason, don't let him separate what belongs together." The stranger's voice came warm from the dark. "He says that because he knows which room you're in." Mason's eyes narrowed. "What room?" The man pointed toward the floor at Mason's knees. At first Mason saw only mud, shrapnel dust, blood, and the ghost shine of red lights across wet concrete. Then the emergency glow shifted, and old black stencil letters emerged beneath the grime. Evidence holding. South Cellar 3. His mouth went dry. Not a bunker. Not at first. Something official once. Repurposed later. Buried under lies. Then, from somewhere below the chamber, a massive lock began to turn. A deep mechanical rotation, slow enough to feel through the concrete under Mason's palms. The girl pressed closer. Owen shut his eyes. Even the stranger stopped moving for 1 second. The turning stopped. Silence followed. Then something under the floor knocked once. Not machinery. Not settling steel. A human knock. Mason's skin went cold. The girl whispered, "There's someone else!" Owen opened his eyes and looked straight at Mason. What Mason saw there was worse than fear. It was memory. Before he could speak, one final monitor flickered alive, separate from the others. No bound woman. No corridor. No empty room. Just an old camera angle aimed at a concrete cell below the chamber. And on the wall of that cell, written in dark letters large enough to fill the screen, were 6 words. Mason Reed never came back for me. The words on the monitor did not feel written. They felt carved. Mason Reed never came back for me for 1 suspended second. Nobody in the chamber moved. Red emergency light washed over concrete, wires, blood, and smoke, but the sentence on the screen seemed to stop time itself. Mason stared without blinking. Every old guilt he had buried under training and silence rose at once. Not just regret. Not just a dead friend's face. An accusation. Personal. Deliberate. Alive. Lena clutched his arm. "What does it mean?" Mason could not answer. Owen could. His voice came low, scraped raw by pain and years. "It means he made sure I stayed alive long enough to hate you." The hooded man in the shadows smiled without warmth. "Not difficult. Isolation does half the work. Time finishes the rest." Mason kept the pistol leveled, but his hand had gone colder than the metal. The accusation dragged him backward through 3 lost years in one rush. The compound. The extraction gone wrong. Fire. Dust. Owen falling. Mason being dragged toward the hello because the roof was collapsing. Shouting that he would go back. Someone pinning him down and telling him there was nothing left to go back for. He had believed that. That belief had built his whole life since. "No," Mason said. "I tried to get back in." Owen held his eyes from across the wired floor. Bruised, thinner, chained to a post in red light. "I know." The stranger's smile faltered. The man wanted division. He wanted Mason and Owen split by hurt because hurt made people reckless. But Owen's answer had cracked the trap. Ranger barked overhead again, then there was a scraping thud somewhere in the ceiling above the side corridor. He was close. The stranger glanced upward. "That dog is becoming expensive." Mason used that moment to read the room again. Wires. Threshold. Owen at center. Side corridor descending left. Monitors to the right. Workbench near the back wall. Generator hum beneath the floor. Lena's eyes remained fixed on the screen showing her mother. "She's alive," she whispered. "She's really alive." Owen saw Mason tracking the room. "Bench," he said. "Under it. Black case. Trigger panel." The hooded man turned slowly toward him. "You disappoint me." "Get used to it," Owen said. Mason shifted the pistol a fraction toward the workbench. The stranger lifted one hand at last. In his grip was a small dead man switch attached to a wire running into his sleeve. "You can try," the man said. "If I lose pressure on this, the room solves itself." Mason stopped. So did Owen. Lena looked from one man to the other and understood enough to go still. Mason spoke without lowering the gun. What do you want? The man's eyes flicked to the green case. The ledger, the keys, and the names attached to both. They'll never gave me everything. You arrived before I finished convincing him. Owen laughed once, dry and painful. You mean torturing. I mean persuasion with a longer horizon. Mason nudged the green case closer with his knee. You could have taken it already. No. I could have taken the box. Not what matters in it. That requires context, authentication, and a man who remembers how field caches were nested when the program was still deniable. The trident on the case. The old brass key. The hidden message. This was a map to something bigger, something Owen had seen and the stranger still had not unlocked. Owen read the realization in his face. Don't open the seal packet. The hooded man smiled. That is why I kept him. Below the chamber floor, the same heavy lock turned again. Slower this time. Longer. Lena flinched against Mason. What's down there? Then Owen said, the ones who didn't make it out. Owen's face had become a ruin of restraint. Cells. Interview rooms. Storage. And after the site was unofficially closed, disposal. The stranger corrected him gently. Containment. A hard impact thundered from the side corridor door above them. Metal buckled. Ranger. The sound came again, followed by claws scrabbling and a guttural snarl. Lena almost cried with relief. He found us. The stranger's thumb tightened slightly on the dead man's switch. One more charge from that animal, and I start removing people. He also saw something else now. The wire leading from the switch into the stranger's sleeve did not disappear into the wall. It ran under the man's coat and along the floor toward a junction box beside the monitors. Not wireless. Hardline. Hardline meant a break was possible. If he had angle. If he had time. If the man looked away. Above them, Ranger hit the corridor door again. This time the upper hinge shrieked. The stranger half turned toward the sound. Ranger! Mason shouted. The barking stopped instantly. The silence that followed was total. Mason spoke toward the ceiling in the old operational cadence he had not used in years. Down! Stay! No bark answered. But no new impact came either. The stranger looked almost impressed. That is remarkable control. He trusts me, Mason said. Owen's eyes shifted minutely toward the black case under the bench. Mason saw it. He had to create a second of divided attention. Enough to get the stranger's eyes off the hardline and onto a moving threat. Enough for Ranger to become chaos again on command. Lena was still staring at her mother's image on the monitors. The silent woman was shaking her head violently. No. 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 The message was obvious. Don't do what he wants. Mason lowered his voice without moving his lips. When I move, crawl backward. Straight back to the doorway. Lena nodded once. Owen understood too. Mason, the stranger snapped. No coaching. Mason fired. Not at the man. At the highest monitor. The screen exploded in sparks and glass. Red light strobed. The stranger flinched toward the sound. Now! Mason roared. Ranger detonated through the side corridor door like a missile. The weakened metal gave way in a scream. The German shepherd hit the stranger high in the shoulders before the man could fully turn. The dead man's switch flew from his hand. Owen lunged sideways against the post at the same instant, dragging his own body out of the center line. The room erupted. Mason dove over the first wire, snatched the switch out of midair before it hit the floor, and hit hard. The stranger slammed backward into the monitor bank with Ranger tearing at his forearm. Lena crawled exactly where Mason had told her. Sparks rained from shattered screens. One wire snapped under the stranger's boot, and somewhere behind the wall a charge boomed harmlessly into concrete. "Bench!" Owen shouted. Mason rolled, shoved the safety cap onto the dead man's switch, and lunged toward the black case beneath the workbench. He grabbed it just as the stranger drove a knee into Ranger's ribs and flung the dog sideways. Ranger hit the floor hard and yelped. The sound ripped through Mason worse than any gunshot. The stranger came up with a knife in his free hand. Mason fired twice. One shot missed in the strobing light. The second caught the man through the side, but not deep enough. He staggered, snarled, and slashed the junction line on the wall instead of charging. Calculated. The lights died. Every screen went black. Emergency power failed, then returned in a dim red glow. Something deeper below woke with a grinding mechanical roar. Owen's voice came sharp through the dark. "He armed the lower doors." The floor shuddered. From the side corridor came the sound of heavy bolts retracting one after another, farther down and below. Whatever had been locked under the chamber was now opening in sequence. The stranger, bleeding and half hidden in dark red light, laughed through clenched teeth. "You wanted everyone together." Mason found Lena by touch and pulled her toward the blasted doorway. "Move!" Ranger staggered to his feet and limped to Mason's side, but his breathing had changed. Wet, ragged. He was hurt. No time to check. Owen strained against the post. "Leave me the cutter! Go get her!" Mason looked at him in disbelief. "Not happening! The lower cells are opening," Owen shouted. "If he releases them all, you lose the child, the mother, and the evidence. You cannot do all three." 3 missions. 2 hands. 1 wounded dog. 1 trapped friend. 1 child already exhausted. An enemy still mobile. Failure was no longer a fear. It was math. The stranger backed toward the side corridor, one hand pressed to his bleeding side, knife still in the other. "Choose carefully, Mason. You only get to save the people who fit inside your guilt." Lena began sobbing. "Mom!" Below them, from the newly opened levels under the floor, came the first human scream. Then another. Then many. And in that terrible rising chorus, Mason realized the worst thing in the room was not the man escaping into the lower corridor. It was that Owen was right. He could not save everyone yet. The screams from below did not sound human at first. They rose through the concrete in thin, ragged layers, too desperate, too sudden, like the buried structure itself had found a voice. Mason felt them in his ribs before his mind translated them. Some were hoarse from silence. Some were fresh with panic. Some cut off so abruptly the absence felt worse than the sound. Lena clamped both hands over her ears. Ranger stood against Mason's leg, limping, chest heaving wetly. Owen strained against the post, wrists bleeding where the restraints had bitten deeper. The hooded man retreated into the side corridor, leaving a dark smear of blood. Failure was math now, Owen had said. But Mason had spent half his life surviving the kind of math designed to leave a body behind. "Owen," he said, already moving. "Where's the mother?" Owen answered instantly. "Level below. Interview wing. Blue stripe. 3rd room if the power doors don't jam. Can you free yourself?" A bitter smile flickered through split lips. "Not before something else reaches me." Another scream climbed through the floor. The stranger laughed from the corridor. "You hear that? Every locked mouth you never knew about is opening at once." Mason shoved the black case into Lena's hands. "Hold this. Do not let go." She stared up at him, tear-streaked and shaking. "What about him?" She meant Owen. Mason knelt just long enough to lock eyes with her. "I am coming back for him. That is not changing." Then he rose and crossed the wire field. Fast, but not blindly. He saw the pattern now, anchors at the shelves, pressure plates under dust, tension lines beyond the post. He stepped between them like a man moving across memory. Ranger followed exactly in his footprints, limping but precise. At Owen's post, Mason dropped the combat knife from the green case into his bound hands. "If anything moves before I'm back, cut the left wire first. Not the right." Owen curled his fingers around the hilt. "You still assume I'm listening. You're alive because you're stubborn. Stay that way." Something heavy slammed below the floor. A door giving way. Mason turned for the corridor. The stranger had vanished into the red half-dark, but he had left signs of passage everywhere. Blood on the wall, one dropped glove, the slow hydraulic hiss of deeper systems awakening. Mason reached the side door and stopped for 1 second to orient. The corridor descended in a narrow switchback, concrete sweating cold. Old directional signs had been painted over, but not well enough to hide what they once said. Property. Intake. Storage. Review. Lena saw the lettering too and whispered, "This was never his house." "No," Mason said. "It was somebody's program." He moved down. Ranger stayed close despite the limp, nose working. Mason felt the same split inside himself. Rescue the mother. Hunt the stranger. Return for Owen. Extract Lena. Preserve evidence. Protect the dog. The list stacked faster than the body could fulfill it. Halfway down the first switchback, they found the first open cell. The steel door hung inward. Inside, under a flickering light, an old man crouched in the corner with his forearms over his head, rocking so violently his teeth clicked. White beard. Sunken cheeks. Shackles still chained to the wall. When he saw Mason, terror crossed his face before hope could. "Don't close it," he blurted. "Please don't close it again." Mason stopped dead. Lena had followed despite the order to stay back. She stared into the room with horror large enough to swallow speech. "How long?" Mason asked. The man's eyes moved around the corridor, as if the walls might punish him for speaking. "I don't know any more." Ranger gave a low warning growl toward the lower stairs. Mason opened the black case with his free hand while keeping the pistol up. Inside were wire cutters, old site badges, 2 sealed folders, and a compact ring of utility keys. He took the keys, tossed the cutters to Lena, and pointed at the chain. "Free him. Then bring him up to Owen and stay there if I don't come back in 2 minutes." Lena caught the cutters clumsily. "I can't." "Yes, you can." There was no time for softness. Mason saw the moment she accepted that. Her breathing steadied by a fraction. She nodded and stepped into the cell. Mason moved lower. The second level opened into a wider hall with a faded blue stripe along the wall. Interview wing. But the blue had been crossed by newer red markings, arrows, numbers, symbols that meant something to whoever repurposed the site after it was erased. Several doors stood open already. Low cries came from some. Silence from others. On the floor near the stairs, a camera lay crushed under a boot print filled with blood. The stranger's trail went left. So did the mother. Mason followed. Third door. It was shut. No lock visible from outside, but the frame had newer hardware bolted onto old hinges. Ranger pressed his nose to the bottom seam and whined once. Human scent. Fear. Familiar to Lena, maybe, but Mason trusted the dog more than guesswork. He inserted 1 utility key. Nothing. Second. Nothing. Third. The lock clicked. Mason opened the door with the pistol up. Inside, a woman jerked upright against a chair, eyes wild from expecting the wrong rescuer. Older than the woman on the drawing. Thinner than the woman on the screens. But unmistakable. Same brow as Lena. Same mouth. Same shock widening her eyes when she saw not the hooded man, but a stranger with a bleeding face and a German shepherd at his knee. Lena? She whispered before Mason could speak. She's alive, he said. Above us. I need to move you now. The woman made a broken sound that was half sob, half laugh, and nodded. Her wrists were zip-tied, ankles chained to the chair. Mason cut the ties first, then tried keys on the ankle chain until one finally turned. As soon as she was free, she tried to stand and nearly collapsed. He caught her under the arm. My daughter, she said. Please. We're going. But Ranger had gone rigid. At the back wall, Mason followed the dog's stare and saw fresh scraped marks along the concrete beside a steel file cabinet bolted in place. Blood had smeared there too. The stranger had stopped in this room. Maybe another passage. Mason shoved the cabinet with one shoulder. It moved half an inch. Hidden rail. Before he could force it farther, a voice came from a speaker overhead. Good. You found what he kept asking for. Mason stepped between the woman and the wall. Come out. The stranger ignored that. Ask her what she did before she became a mother in a story. The woman went still in Mason's grip. Not fear. Recognition. Mason felt it instantly. He turned his head just enough to see her face. What is he talking about? She shook her head once. Too fast. Too automatic. The speaker crackled with quiet amusement. That's the problem with survivors. Eventually they become witnesses, and witnesses become historians. She was never supposed to keep either skill. Mason's throat tightened. Who are you? The stranger laughed, still asking the small question. Then the file cabinet slid sideways on its own with a hydraulic hiss. Behind it was not a tunnel. It was a control alcove. Monitors. Audio boards. Old reel archives converted to digital racks. And on the central wall, under plexiglass, a row of official photographs. Not victims. Staff. One face was the hooded man, younger, clean-shaven, standing beside uniformed officials in a ribbon-cutting photo. Another was a much younger Owen in dress blues, image cropped from a commendation board. And between them, smiling for the camera with a side badge clipped to her jacket, stood Lena's mother. The room tilted under Mason's feet. And Owen Vale's face in the glass made the reveal hit harder. Lena's voice echoed from the hall behind him. Mom? Mason turned. She had come down the corridor with the freed old man behind her, and the cutter still in one shaking hand. When her eyes found the photograph in the alcove, she stopped as if she had been shot. The old man saw it too and whispered, No, not her. The mother reached toward her daughter and failed to find words. Lena looked from the photo to the woman, then back again. Grief, relief, confusion, betrayal. You work here? The mother's mouth trembled. Lena, listen to me. You work here? Mason felt the answer before she gave it. Not random victim. Not simple witness. Part of the place before becoming trapped by it. The stranger's voice filled the speaker again, softer now. Tell her your real name. The woman's shoulders collapsed. When she spoke, it came out barely above a whisper. My name isn't Mara. Lena stared as if language itself had broken. The woman lifted red-rimmed eyes to her daughter, to Mason, to the photographs, and finally gave them the truth that split the whole night open. My name is Dr. Miriam Vale. The name detonated in the corridor. Dr. Miriam Vale. For one impossible beat, no one breathed. Lena stood frozen in the doorway with the cutters hanging from one hand. The old man behind her stared into the control alcove, as though the dead had stepped into electric light. Mason felt the whole buried structure tilt again, not from any movement under the floor this time, but from the sudden rearranging of everything he thought he understood. Vale. Owen's name. The box. The accusation on the cell wall. The woman on the monitors. The child in the tree. He turned toward Miriam. You're his what? Her face crumpled, but she forced the answer out. "Sister." The word hit like a second blast. From the speaker overhead, the stranger made a soft, satisfied sound. "And now all the family ghosts are in the same room." Lena took one step back from her mother. Then another. "You lied to me." Miriam's eyes filled. "I hid you. You lied to me." The raw hurt in the girl's voice cut sharper than the screams below. Mason saw the same fracture move through Miriam that he had seen in Owen when the accusation on the monitor appeared. Not fear. Shame worn so long it had become muscle memory. "There was no safe truth," Miriam said. "Not for you." Ranger growled toward the control boards. His body was still low from the injury to his ribs, but his eyes never left the dark spaces beyond the monitors. He smelled what the others couldn't yet. Movement. Mason caught it a heartbeat later in the reflection of the plexiglass. Not the hooded man himself, but the faint shift of shadow in the access passage behind the control alcove. "Down!" Mason shouted. He grabbed Lena and yanked her sideways just as a burst of gunfire tore through the glass. Plexiglass shattered across the room in glittering sheets. The old man dropped flat. Miriam cried out as bullets chewed through the photo wall behind her, punching through younger faces and old official smiles. Ranger lunged toward the muzzle flashes with a savage bark, but Mason caught his harness and held him back a fraction too late to keep the dog from straining against broken ribs. The firing stopped. Silence rushed in hot and ringing. Then the stranger's voice returned, now closer and stripped of all performance. "You always force me to damage the archives." Mason dragged Lena behind the overturned file cabinet and pushed Miriam down beside her. "Stay here." Lena clutched at his sleeve. "Is he my uncle?" The question landed like shrapnel. Mason looked at Miriam. She shook her head violently. "No. Owen is." Lena stared at her mother, then at Mason, and the truth completed itself in the air between them. The surname. The hidden site. The drawings. The soldier who came before the storm. Owen was not just connected. He was blood. A fresh scream rose from the lower wing, closer now, followed by pounding feet and doors banging open one after another. The released prisoners, or captives, or witnesses, or whatever this place had made of people, were moving upward. The stranger knew it too. "Clock's running, Mason. If they reach the upper fire before you control them, you lose everyone." "Why keep them alive?" Mason shouted back. "Records with pulses are harder to erase," Miriam answered before the speaker could. Her voice had gone hollow. "He kept the ones who saw too much. Used them when memory was useful. Broke them when it wasn't." The speaker crackled. "That's an unfair simplification from a woman who designed half the intake questions." Lena recoiled from her mother, as if struck. Miriam's face emptied. There it was. The part she had hoped not to say aloud in front of her daughter. Mason could see the old professional shape of her underneath the fear now. Educated, precise, guilty in ways bigger than survival. "You work here," Mason said. "I built the evaluation models," she whispered. "At first, I thought it was a containment study. Debriefing. Witness protection triage. By the time I understood what they were doing with the children, with the detainees, with the disappearances, Owen had already found the ledgers." The speaker laughed softly. "And love of family ruined two promising careers." Mason edged to the side of the overturned cabinet and checked the angle into the alcove. No clear shot. Only sparking boards, torn glass, and the dark slot of the access passage beyond. "Where is he?" "Behind the west relay channel," Miriam said instantly. "There's a ladder to the service spine. It links all levels." She knew the place too well. Every answer she gave made Lena fold further inward. Ranger barked once toward the ceiling. A new sound rolled through the hall. Water. Not a pipe leak. A rush. Hard and fast, somewhere below. Miriam heard it and went pale. No! Mason looked at her. What? He's opening the floodgates! Another burst of pounding came from the lower corridor, followed by a wave of panicked voices climbing the stairs. Then Mason smelled it, old groundwater and chemical runoff forced through rusting drains. This site was built onto the creek, Miriam said, breathing too fast now. Emergency purge protocol could drown the evidence levels in under 10 minutes. The stranger's voice came back warm again, almost kind. 8, if the lower seals fail cleanly. Lena grabbed Mason's wrist with both hands. My mom, move, Mason said. He made the decision in one breath. Get them back to Owen. Free Owen. Use Owen to read the site. Extract upward before flood and fire meet. Hunt the stranger only if the path opens. There was no perfect rescue left. Only order of losses. He shoved the black case back at Miriam. Carry this. She took it automatically. To the Blue Hall Junction, Mason said. Stay ahead of me. Lena with you. Old man behind. Lena did not want to go near her mother, but the first blast of icy water surged around the lower corner of the corridor and made the choice for her. It slammed into the far wall waist high, carrying papers, cups, and one broken shoe in its churn. Voices below erupted into full panic. Now! Mason barked. They ran. Miriam limped but moved fast, driven by terror and familiarity. Lena stayed just off her shoulder, not touching her. The old man stumbled after them. Mason backed up with the pistol raised and Ranger guarding the rear. The water spread across the hall in seconds, black with silt and old filth, rising over Mason's boots. The speaker followed them from overhead. You know what always fascinated me, Mason? Everyone in this place believed they were here to save someone. At the Blue Junction turn, a steel door on the left exploded open. 3 people came out at once, half-starved and wild-eyed, chains still hanging from one man's wrists. They froze when they saw the armed stranger in tactical posture, the bleeding dog, the terrified child, the woman carrying a case, and the flood chasing all of them. Down! Mason shouted. One obeyed. One ran. One charged. Mason pivoted and slammed the attacker into the wall instead of shooting. The man clawed at him in pure animal panic, trying to climb over Mason's shoulders to get past. Ranger snapped at the air beside the man's face, not biting, forcing distance. Miriam dragged Lena clear. The old man screamed at the charging prisoner to stop, but the corridor had become too loud for words to matter. The water hit them all at knee height, and nearly took Mason's feet out from under him. He drove an elbow into the attacker's sternum, shoved him aside, and surged forward again. More doors were opening now. More faces. Gaunt. Confused. Terrified. The released levels were emptying into the same channels they needed to cross. Service spine! Miriam shouted over the roar. If he's headed up, he'll cut us off at the chamber. Mason felt the trap closing. The stranger would not need to stand and fight. Fire above. Flood below. Panicked prisoners in between. He had built the site to turn every rescue into a stampede. They hit the stairs to Owen's level just as the lights failed for 2 full seconds. In blackness, the buried structure sounded alive. Water hammering concrete. People screaming. Metal doors slamming. Ranger snarling. Lena crying for her mother, and then stopping herself halfway through the word as if she no longer knew what to call her. Then the red emergency lights came back, and Mason saw the danger waiting at the top. The chamber door stood open. Owen was no longer tied to the post, and stretched across the threshold at chest height, hidden before by shadow and smoke, was a fresh line of detonator cord wired to 6 blocks of explosive packed into the broken frame. Above the cord, spray-painted across the wall in fresh black letters, was a single instruction from the stranger. Cut the wrong line, and Owen dies first. Then, from somewhere beyond the chamber, Mason heard Owen shout one word into the chaos. "Duck!" Every fuse was already burning red now. Owen's warning cracked through the corridor an instant before the first fuse spat sparks into Mason's face. "Duck!" Mason did not think. He drove Lena, Miriam, and the old man flat into the floodwater as the detonator cord flashed white across the doorway. Ranger slammed into Mason's shoulder a heartbeat later, knocking him lower just as the charges blew. The blast punched outward in a wall of heat, dust, and concrete fragments. The broken chamber vomited fire into the hall. Shrapnel screamed overhead. One steel bracket ripped loose and buried itself in the opposite wall where Lena's head had been half a second earlier. For 3 seconds the world vanished into smoke. Then sound came back in pieces. Ranger coughing. Lena choking. The old man moaning. Water still rushing up from the lower levels. Mason forced himself up through the haze, and saw that the doorway had collapsed inward, but not completely. The blast had shredded the booby trap without bringing down the full chamber. Broken concrete and twisted frame metal blocked most of the opening, leaving a narrow breach low on the right side. "Owen!" Mason shouted. "Here!" "Alive!" The answer came from inside the smoke-filled room, closer to the floor. Mason dropped to his knees in the water and crawled toward the breach. Heat licked across his back from the burning upper levels, while colder floodwater shoved against his chest from below. Ranger wedged himself beside Mason, ignoring pain, and began clawing at loose rubble. Together they opened enough space for a man to drag through. Then a hand appeared from inside, blood-slick and shaking. Mason seized it. For one impossible second the years between them seemed to pull harder than muscle and bone. Then Owen Vale came through the breach in a rain of dust and sparks, half crawling, half falling into the corridor flood. Thinner. Bruised. Barely steady. But free. Mason caught him before he hit the wall. Neither man spoke. They locked there for a second, shoulder to shoulder, like language had been made too small by what survival cost. Then the moment was gone because the corridor was filling faster, and the dead were not the only things trying to stay buried. Lena stared at Owen with wide eyes. "You're really my uncle?" Owen looked at her, then at Miriam, then back to the child. In the red emergency light his face broke open in a way Mason had never seen. "Yeah," he said roughly. "I am." Miriam stepped toward him, clutching the black case to her chest. "Owen!" He flinched before she touched him. That hurt her more visibly than the gunfire had. Water surged higher, slapping against their thighs now. More released prisoners were crying somewhere below, but the screams had changed direction. They were rising toward them. "We move now," Mason said. "Talk later." Owen nodded once and took command as if no years had passed. "Upper chamber is dead. Fire road exit through the service spine. There's a lift cage above the relay shaft, but the manual release is in the archive room." "The one behind the control alcove?" Miriam asked. Owen's eyes cut toward her. "You remember." "I remember everything." "Good. Then remember how fast this place drowns." Another body slammed into the blue hall corner below them, not hostile this time but desperate. A teenage boy surfaced from the rising water, gasping and wild-eyed, wrists bleeding from snapped restraints. He saw the group at the stairs and reached toward them. Behind him came 2 more figures, then 4, then a whole knot of survivors fighting the current and each other to stay above water. Mason swore under his breath. The old man beside Lena whispered, "If they all rush the stairs, we're dead." He was right. Narrow stairwell. Panic. Flood from below. Fire from above. Owen saw the same geometry instantly. We split the current, he said. Open the side intake doors. Give them a wider path. Miriam looked at him. Those doors jammed years ago. Not if the purge fails dirty. She understood at once. The pressure's blown the old seals. Mason handed her the ring of utility keys. Can you do it? She nodded and thrust the black case at Owen. Hold this. Owen took it, but his expression changed the second his fingers touched the lid. Miriam, he said too sharply. Why is this open? No one answered fast enough. Because behind them, farther up the hall, footsteps splashed once through shallow water. Slow, measured, unhurried. The stranger was still above them. Ranger growled toward the sound, for lifting along his spine despite the limp. Mason raised the pistol. Owen drew the combat knife from the case. Lena moved closer to Miriam, this time by instinct rather than trust. The footsteps stopped. Then the speaker system crackled weakly back to life on emergency backup. You keep surviving the wrong endings, the stranger said. His voice came from everywhere now, thin but intimate, floating through hall speakers half drowned by water. Miriam, open the intake doors. Mason, head for the archive. Owen, bring me the sealed packet. If each of you obeys one instruction, enough of you may leave with your favorite illusion intact. Owen's mouth hardened. He's trying to spread us. He doesn't need to, Mason said. The building's doing that for him. Lena looked up through wet hair. What's in the packet? No one answered. That told her more than words. The flood rose to Mason's waist. The first survivors from below hit the foot of the stairs and began clawing for footing. Not attacking, just drowning. A woman with a shaved head screamed for a child who was not with her. The teenage boy nearly went under again. The old man beside Lena broke first and stumbled down 2 steps toward them. We can't leave them. Mason grabbed his shoulder before the current took both of them. He looked at Owen. Owen looked at Miriam. Some choices ended arguments the second they arrived. Doors first, Owen said. All of them. Miriam splashed downward with the keys before anyone could object. Lena stared after her, torn between fury and the need to keep her only parent in sight. Then she bolted after her. Lena! Mason shouted. But the child was already gone around the bend. Mason cursed and moved to follow, only for Owen to catch his arm. Trust her mother to save her. Mason looked at him incredulously. After all this? Owen's face tightened. You wanted the truth. Here it is. Miriam did terrible work for bad people. Then she burned her life trying to get one child out before the site was erased. That child was Lena. The words hit hard, but there was no time to absorb them. Below, metal shrieked as Miriam forced a key into an old lock. A second later, one of the intake doors blew open under water pressure. The current changed instantly, dragging half the flood sideways into a drainage channel. Survivors below slammed against the new flow, then began clawing toward the opening instead of the stairs. It's working! Lena shouted from below. A second door opened. Then a third. The crush at the stairs loosened. For the first time all night, the path upward looked possible. Mason turned to Owen. Archive room. Get the manual release. Then we take the cage up. Owen nodded, still holding the black case. You me, Ranger. The old man grabbed Mason's sleeve. And the rest of us? You come when I call, Mason said. Not before. The man nodded shakily. They moved fast. Up one flight. Across the relay hall. Toward the archive wing where the stranger had hidden behind history all night. Ranger led despite the limp, nose low, growl rumbling through the dark. Smoke was thinner here, but the heat worse. Above them, the cabin fire had spread into root channels and vents. At the archive door, Owen stopped cold. The lock had already been opened from inside. Mason and Owen exchanged a look. Too easy. Mason eased the door inward with the pistol first. The room beyond was lined with shelves of box tapes, old drives, paper files sealed in bins, and one manual control pedestal at the back wall beside a grated lift shaft rising into darkness. The release lever was there. Untouched. Near resolution. Near escape. Exactly the kind of moment traps loved. Ranger barked once toward the ceiling. Mounted above the lift shaft was a camera with a blinking green light. Fresh. Powered. Watching them. On the control pedestal, under the lever, lay a single photograph placed carefully face up. Lena as a baby. In Owen's arms. Mason felt Owen go rigid beside him. On the back wall, written in black marker large enough to read even in emergency light, were 7 words. Ask Miriam who Lena's father really is. The room went very still. Owen did not move. Did not breathe. Did not blink. Then, from the speaker hidden somewhere above the shaft, the stranger delivered the twist like a knife turned slowly. You've been rescuing the wrong family all night. The sentence on the wall hollowed the room in a single breath. Ask Miriam who Lena's father really is. Owen did not move. He stood in the archive doorway with the black case in one hand and the knife in the other, but something in his face went still in a way Mason recognized instantly. Ranger's growl rolled through the room, aimed at the lift shaft camera above the lever. The speaker cracked softly. You wanted truth, the stranger said. Truth arrives hungry. Mason kept the pistol trained on the catwalk shadows. You're running out of places to hide. No, Mason. I'm reducing yours. Owen stepped toward the photograph with unnatural care. He looked down at the image of himself younger, holding Lena as an infant. Mason watched him absorb it, then said the only useful thing left. We confirm with Miriam. Not with him. Owen's jaw tightened. Yeah. No more time. Mason crossed to the control pedestal. A blinking red indicator below the lever pulsed once every 2 seconds. Armed. Trap. Owen, Mason said. Check under the pedestal. Owen crouched, set down the case, and swept his hand beneath the console. His expression darkened. Pressure switch. Lever triggers a charge if lifted before the floor plate locks. Can you bypass it? Probably. Probably gets people killed, the stranger said through the speaker. Ranger barked once, then stared toward the far shelving rows. Movement. Mason pivoted just as something metallic flashed through the dark. He fired on reflex. The object shattered against a filing shelf and burst in a spray of sparks and acid smoke. Not a grenade. A corrosive ampoule. Owen! I've got it! Owen jammed the knife into the pedestal housing and ripped away a panel, exposing old wiring and a relay box. Mason backed toward the shelves, tracking the smoke and shadows. Ranger limped wider despite the pain in his ribs. Then a voice came from the hall. Mason! Lena. He risked one glance. Miriam was there with Lena, soaked to the bone, the old man behind them with 2 more survivors. Stay back! Mason shouted. Lena ignored him and saw the writing on the wall. Then she saw the photograph in Owen's hand. And then she saw Owen's face. Mama, she whispered without taking her eyes off him. What does it mean? Miriam stopped in the doorway. For a second Mason thought she might lie again. But something in Owen's expression ended that option. Miriam, he said. Tell her. The speaker came alive at once. Careful. Family honesty tends to trigger structural damage. Mason fired out the nearest speaker and blew it from the wall. Silence rushed in. Only floodwater. Failing alarms. Ranger breathing hard. Miriam looked at her daughter. At Owen. At the photograph. Then she told the truth before fear could edit it. Your father is Owen. The words landed without echo. Lena stared at her, then at Owen, then back again. No. You said he died? Miriam nodded, tears finally breaking free. Because I thought he was. Then I learned he wasn't. And by then, they were watching everything. Owen looked as if someone had taken the air out of his chest. You knew. I knew late, Miriam said. I found out after I got Lena out. I spent years trying to find where they'd buried you. Lena's eyes filled with old grief and a new one being born. You lied to me my whole life. Yes. Both of you did. Owen flinched. I didn't know you existed. That stopped her harder than the confession had. All night she had seen him as mystery, soldier, uncle, maybe family. Now she was seeing a man who had missed every birthday not because he left, but because he had been locked beneath a world and made into a ghost. Mason wanted to give them time. The building did not. A rapid beeping erupted from the pedestal under Owen's hands. He swore. He tied the bypass to motion in the shaft. He's climbing! The stranger's voice returned, not from the speaker, but from above them in the lift shaft itself. Good. Everyone together. Mason stepped beneath the shaft opening and aimed up. You lose, Mason called. No, the stranger answered. I close. Then the archive room lights snapped from red to white. Blinding. A shot cracked from the catwalk overhead. Another. Shelving exploded into paper and splinters. Survivors screamed in the hall. Ranger launched upward at empty air, barking so hard his injured body shook with it. Mason fired 3 times toward the muzzle flashes. One ricocheted. One shattered a lamp. One drew a curse. Hit. Owen! 2 seconds. Mason moved toward Lena and Miriam, shoving them behind the pedestal as more rounds tore into the room. The old men hauled one survivor flat by the ankles. Above, the stranger shifted positions along the catwalk. Do you know why I kept him alive, Mason? He shouted. Because men who lose everything still produce useful answers. Owen ripped a final wire free. The pedestal lock snapped open. Now! He yelled. Mason reached for the lever, and Lena reached first. She saw the floor plate Owen had mentioned, saw the gap where the pressure switch seated, and slammed her heel into the locking brace at the pedestal base before Mason pulled the handle. The plate dropped into place with a metal crack. The trap died. Mason yanked the lever down. Chains thundered, and the lift cage released with a violent shudder. A rusted platform dropped from the shaft ceiling on emergency rails, slamming to a stop level with the archive floor. The stranger knew it too. He leaned over the catwalk for the shot that would deny it, and Ranger saw him first. The German shepherd hit the shaft ladder in a blur of pain and loyalty. He climbed 3 rungs, launched off bent metal, and caught the stranger's gun arm with all the force he had left. The man screamed and fired wildly into the ceiling. Mason saw his chance. He shot once. The bullet caught the stranger high in the chest and threw him backward into the catwalk rail. Old Bolt screamed. Steel buckled. For one suspended second the man hung there, one hand clutching the mangled rail, the other trying to tear free from Ranger. Then the catwalk gave way. The stranger fell. Ranger twisted clear at the last instant and crashed onto the lift cage roof. The man hit the archive floor beside the pedestal with a sound that ended argument. He was still alive for one last breath, blood filling his mouth, eyes locked on Mason. Mason stepped over him. No more rooms, he said. The man tried to smile and failed. Then he died. Load them up, Mason shouted. Survivors poured from the hall. The old man helped 2 weaker prisoners onto the cage. Miriam climbed in with shaking hands. Lena did not. She stood between her parents. Owen looked at her like a starving man looking at daylight. You don't have to forgive this tonight. Lena swallowed hard. Are you really my dad? The question broke him more completely than chains or torture had. Yes, he said. And I'm sorry I wasn't there. She stared 1 second longer, then crossed the distance and wrapped both arms around him so suddenly he almost lost his balance. Owen made a sound Mason had never heard from any soldier in any war. Miriam covered her mouth and cried openly. Ranger limped to Mason's side, then leaned his weight against Mason's leg. Mason dropped to one knee and put both hands into the dog's wet fur. You did good, he whispered. You did everything right. Sirens sounded faintly above. Real ones. Mason looked around the ruined archive. The dead architect of the nightmare on the floor, the open case of evidence, the freed survivors loading into the lift cage, the family rebuilt out of lies and floodwater and one impossible dog's insistence, and felt something in his own chest loosen for the first time in years. Not absolution. Something quieter. Permission to keep living. He stepped into the cage last. As it shuddered upward through the service spine, cold dawn began leaking down from the broken cabin above. Rain had softened to mist. Paramedics and deputies rushed in when the cage reached the surface. Mason barely heard them. He watched Lena hold Miriam's hand with one fist and Owen's sleeve with the other, refusing to let either disappear again. He watched survivors emerge into morning one by one. He watched Ranger lower himself to the wet earth and finally rest. The hollow tree stood split open beside the ruins, empty now. Owen came to stand beside Mason under the first clean light of dawn. Finally Owen looked at Ranger, and then at Mason. He led you here. Mason nodded. Yeah. Owen's tired mouth lifted slightly. Good dog. Mist moved through the trees. Mason looked at the light, then at the people still breathing because one dog refused to ignore what no one expected inside a hollow tree. And for the first time since the mission that was supposed to end him, he did not feel haunted when the rain stopped. He felt home.